Well, thank you guys for joining us here on the Super Saturday Sofubi Show. I am here talking with Matt Alt, a writer based in Tokyo, Japan, the birthplace of Sofubi, of course. And Matt is, I've actually known Matt for a few years now. Oh my God, actually, dude, this is 10 years now.
Where did we meet?
In 2011, I reached out to you because I came to Tokyo and I did an interview with you about yokai for the Kaiju Cast.
Right.
And we sat in the park in Koenji.
Yes.
And we chatted about yokai for about 20 minutes.
Yes,
Dude,
yes.
Happy 10th year anniversary, Matt.
Yeah, it's our friend. It's your friendiversary, as they say on Facebook. Yeah.
Oh man, so well, Matt and I have known each other a little bit, and but I knew Matt's name way before I actually got to meet him in person because of his involvement with Toy Box DX. In addition to writing and working on that website, Matt is an actual book writer. He has written Yokai Attack, YUREI Attack, and Ninja Attack, and his newest book is called Pure Invention: How Japan's Pop Culture Conquered
the World.
The world, yes.
Not just
the
us.
World, Matt. not just me.
Not just our living rooms and display rooms, but the whole world, yes.
Well, thank you so much for being here, man.
Well, thanks for having me.
It's really great to have you on here.
How can I help you?
Well, first up, let's hear a little bit about your own personal history. I know mostly the people who know you from the giant robot stuff with Toy Box DX, which was a wonderful website. Still is a wonderful website because it's still available.
It is a little decrepit these days. Everybody's moved from blogs to social media, but it is still there.
But aside from the robot stuff, do you have any history with soft vinyl toys? Are you a fan of Sofubi?
Well, robots were definitely my first love. When I was a little kid, I got a Shogun Warrior for my birthday. This must have been in 78 or 79, one of those big polyethylene 2 feet tall robot toys. And they had Japanese on the stomach, right? And that was like realizing that there was a nation of people out there who thought that giant robots and kaiju were as cool as I thought they were was like a huge eye-opening experience for me, even as a kid. But, I consumed, I had a pretty balanced diet. It wasn't just robots. I watched Godzilla movies and Ultraman and, basically anything I could get my hands on that had that sort of Japanese tokusatsu, anime, what have you, flavor to it. But I didn't actually really actively start collecting vinyls until I moved to Japan in college in the early 90s for a year-long exchange program. And this is around 93, 94, when there was this kind of blossoming of real kaiju vinyl culture in the form of these Bandai vinyls that were really expertly sculpted. They had a lot of detail. They're about, 5 inches, 6 inches tall?
Yeah, 6 to 8, depending on which one you get. Definitely.
Made of really nice hard vinyl, and they were just they were obviously how would I describe it? They were obviously more care had been put into them than their price would suggest, because they were really cheap. You could just pick them up for 1,000 yen or 1,500 yen at the time. Later on, a lot of them became really sought after collectibles. Of course, certain ones in the line were produced in less numbers or just more desirable. But so I really got into this. I was a kind of robot guy, and in the 80s, robots meant kind of realistic robots like Gundam or Dougram or Zabungle or what have you. So when I started collecting kaiju toys, I kind of initially went down that route with the kind of realistic kaiju toys.
Right.
And it wasn't until later that I realized there had this entire history leading up to that point of portrayals of kaiju and vinyl that weren't anywhere nearly as they were still really cool and they were still really charming, but they were kind of sculpted to a completely different aesthetic than what I had known. And that was really interesting to learn that there was this sort of prehistory there.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that history, especially going to your book, right? So tell me a little bit about what you have learned about, well, first up, just for the listeners or the viewers who don't know, you've been living in Japan since 1993?
No, since 2003. So I've been here,
Since
God,
2003.
what is that? It's like 18 years. It's crazy.
a long time.
I never imagined I'd be living here this long. But anyway, I run a translation company here with my wife, Hiroko Yoda, who is also my co-author on a lot of the books I've done. She is the yokai expert in this relationship. So we did Yokai Attack together and YUREI and Ninja Attack together. But the toy thing is really, that's my thing.
Yeah.
And toys really did change the direction of my life. Like if it hadn't been for Japanese toys, I wouldn't have become interested in Japan. I wouldn't have started learning the language. I wouldn't have launched this, career as a translator and later a writer. So, it's really important to me. They're really,
Right.
I believe they're an important form of history. And toys form the kind of cornerstone of my new book that just came out in 2020. It's called Pure Invention, as you said. And it basically tells the story of Japan's rise from the ashes of World War II, when it was just this defeated, burned out husk of a country, into this cultural superpower that we know it today. And it tells that story through hit products. Each chapter is kind of centered around a hit product. And the very first chapter is centered around toys. In particular, it's centered around tin toys, but that actually links, as I learned when I was writing it, very directly into vinyl toys and later things. Like we think of tin toys as like, boomer collectibles, as, kind of these really expensive robots and things that, the Christie's, they go for like $50,000. So they were never really on my radar. But those tin toys put Japan back on the map as a manufacturing power. They were like the first products of any kind that Japan started making after World War II. And they were the first products that the American military let Japan start exporting in the late 40s and early 1950s.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so in a really very real way, toys jump-started modern Japan. And
Wow. Way to go, toys.
Yes, exactly. Go toys. And actually, when I was writing the book, I learned that obviously Japan was this feudal nation back in the 1800s, right? And then, the Americans sailed in and basically opened the ports, and Japan had to kind of really quickly modernize to catch up with other nations, so it wouldn't be left behind. It wouldn't be colonized. Is basically what the danger was back then. And one of the really fascinating things I found was at the turn of the 20th century, we're talking like the kind of the teens and the roaring 20s. It was toys that were Japan's first major exports abroad, again, to the point where Japanese toys started to take over foreign marketplaces to such an extent that the American toy making industry, this is like in the 1920s, lobbied the government for tariffs to stop Japanese toys coming into the American marketplace. So toys have always been this really kind of, there's been this strong connection between toys and Japan and the outside world, and the way that all of us as outside nations relate to Japan. Certainly in those early years, it was all about toys. And, now certainly for us, even in these modern times, it's all about toys. So maybe sometimes things just come full circle, huh?
Definitely. I didn't realize that Japan's history in the world market of toys went back so far. That's amazing.
Yes. This is all stuff that I learned when I was writing Pure Invention, but it turns out that in the early 1900s, Germany dominated the market for toys worldwide. If you had a rocking horse, if you had a celluloid doll, if you had, whatever it was, it probably came from Germany. And Germany had the best toy makers. Germany had the best, manufacturers. And they had entire cities devoted to, the toy making industry back then. But then what happened? World War I happened. And Germany obviously got sucked into having to do military production, its toy makers got pulled into military production. People weren't buying German things because, Germany's being blockaded, there's all sorts of things going on. So right around that time, Japan's like, hey, our chance. And that's right when World War I is right when Japan jumps into the toy making business and is actually from about 1915 up until the early 1930s, they were poised to become, by the early 1930s, they were poised to become the world's top exporter of toys, even before World War II. And then they invaded China, and then World War II broke out, and that put an end to that. It crushed that entire industry. So
war kills your toy industry, guys. I think that's a life lesson for the world.
not war.
War.
To paraphrase.
Dude, you better trademark that and put that on a shirt, right?
Seriously, man, it's true. Make toys, not war. I'd rather see toys than war. But yeah, so there's this long history there. Like, it's not like Japan just suddenly is like, hey, let's make toys in the 1960s or 70s. You know, toy making was one of the big ways that Japan reached out to the world. And in fact, even before then, like the first observers who came to Japan in the 1800s noticed how many toy stores there were in Japanese cities and villages. Like, they were actually shocked by this. And that they'd see adults playing with toys, which was like completely blew the minds of British and American and European, mainland European people, because adults just didn't do that in the West.
Right.
You did not do that. And to see like a grown man flying a kite or playing with a top, you know, those are kind of 19th century, you know, playthings, was just completely beyond the beyond to these Western observers. But it shows that like there's this kind of love for play in Japan and this kind of respect for play, and that you could be an adult who made, you know, toys and be a craftsperson and be respected for it in society and even loved for it.
Absolutely.
So which leads
I'm
into
really glad you touched on that. I just quickly want to say I'm glad you touched on that, the craftsman aspect of toys, is because, you know, worldwide toys are made of all sorts of different ways and made of all sorts of different components. But in the Japanese market, since I've been looking at these soft vinyl creations, I have started to really appreciate the artistry and the craftsmanship that goes into it. And especially learning about this stuff has really helped me appreciate the craftsmanship involved. It's not just about toys and profit and making things for kids.
Well, I think there's a real dedication to the vocation of making toys in Japan. I mean, it's not seen as something regressive or infantile. I mean, even if you are selling toys to infants, it's understood that adults have to create them, and that, you know, if you throw yourself into that body and soul, you know, that's a really worthy endeavor, as worthy as anything else. And, you know, it's something that I've noticed in my own interactions with Japanese craftspeople. And it's not even just the craftspeople, it's also like the people involved in the merchandising of the toys. For instance, you know, there's a gentleman who I had the great fortune to be introduced to about 15 years back by the name of Saburo Ishizuki. And we'll be talking about him a little bit later. But he is a former executive at Marusan and Bullmark and ARC, and is now kind of running Bullmark's reissue operations today. He's got to be in his 80s now. But, you know, he, you know, not to put too fine a line on it, lives this shit. I mean, and when you hang out with him, when I've hung out with him, it's interesting. When a kid walks by with a toy, he'll just be like watching to see, how is that kid playing with it? How is he interacting with it? You know, when we're walking down the street, you know, if you happen to pass a toy shop, or even like, you know, just see toys hanging on on the rack at a convenience store or something like that, right, he'll be drawn to it. You know, we are too, but it's interesting seeing somebody who's in a generation above us having the same kind of connection.
Absolutely. And with the business mind too, behind it as well. Yeah. I would love to see that in action. That'd be cool.
Oh yeah, definitely. And he's not a sculptor. He is a toy man in the sense of, you know, being in the industry and having kind of the more strategic vision and stuff like that. And we'll talk about him because he's really, really key to the conversation of why kaiju vinyls happened and how they happened. But yeah, that's that sense of craftsmanship kind of it's just kind of part of the business of making toys here, I think.
And do you find that even though we're still seeing, like you mentioned, Bullmark and Marusan, like we're still seeing them producing things today in a much more limited fashion, does that still resonate with the audience there in Japan? Like, I'm assuming that people are still stoked that Bullmark is back or Marusan is back and like producing things, even if it's not, you know, thousands of pieces heading to the major toy stores, you know.
Well, I mean, there's definitely a market for it here because there's a lot of people, you know, kaiju toys were mainstream here. They were major toys, like on the level in the West of a Barbie or something like that. So the number of people who remember them is much larger as a
Right.
percentage of population than in America, of course. To us, these were kind of like rare imports that you would find if you were lucky. But if you were in Japan in the 1960s and you were a kid, you couldn't avoid kaiju vinyls. They were everywhere. They were literally the Pokemon of their era. And especially when you get around to the year 1967, when it's understood, when the industry realizes that kaiju are the next big thing, it's not just one company, it's multiple companies. It's multiple production companies making multiple kaiju TV shows. There's multiple kaiju movies coming out. There's a ton of sponsors and toy companies making this stuff. So yeah, if you were a kid from about 1967 on, kaiju were definitely part of your life. And because of that, as you become an adult, of course, there's going to be a certain number of people who remember them and are nostalgic for them, enough to support these kind of nostalgia operations like Marasan and like Bullmark. And I just think it's really cool that, with Bullmark and Marasan's great. Kaminaga-san is a really cool guy, but Ishizuki-san was actually at Bullmark in the day, and the fact that he's still involved with it now is just, it's more than cool. It's actually a miracle because, when you start doing investigations and research into old toys, you realize how many people have either moved on or passed away since the 1960s and 1970s.
Yeah.
I hate to say it, it's a long time ago. I don't want to say it, but it is. It's a long time ago.
Just even being just trying to interview people who were part of the movies, which is what we were, I used to do at the Kaiju Cast all the time. It's just every year you hear about one person who no longer with us,
Yes.
I can imagine just as we get older, as time marches on, this is not going to be something that gets better. Yeah, absolutely. Well, can we talk a little bit about the birth of this? We talked about tin toys. How did Marusan and Bullmark come to be?
In the beginning, there was tin, and really, in the beginning, there was tin because the main forms of toys back in time, before plastics became more commonly used, were aluminum, tin, things like that, metal toys, lead, and also celluloid, which is a kind of precursor to plastic, and that was used a lot in dolls and things like that. Tin, like a lot of these big makers that of now, like Marusan, for instance, they started out making tin toys. Marusan, actually, the company who is most associated with the birth of kaiju toys is Marusan. And Marusan started life in the late 1940s. It was founded initially as a distributor of optical toys, which were kind of cheap little plastic telescopes and binoculars and things like that. And but they had this kind of dream of expanding into their own toys. And as it turns out, one of their founders was obsessed with cars. And when I spoke to Ishizuki-san, who worked at Marusan when he was a kid, their company car was this fire engine red MG that they'd drive around town in. And obviously they'd bought it because it was cool, less than it was useful. And so they got the idea to make their own original toy cars. And they did. They made these beautiful tin cars. They worked with outside craftsmen, most famously a guy named Matsuzo Kosuge, who is literally one of the founding fathers of the modern tin industry in Japan. They made these beautiful Cadillacs and Buicks and things like that. But, kids' tastes change, right? And what happened was, in the 1950s, every kid wanted a car. They wanted a awesome, streamlined, American car. That was the dream. What happens? Russia launches Sputnik, right? And then suddenly the space race is on. And almost overnight, kids are cars. I want a spaceship. I want a ray gun. And this is exactly. And this is around the time, this is the early 1960s. Astro Boy is broadcast. And the Godzilla movies start shifting from these kind of dark social criticisms of we shouldn't drop nuclear weapons on things to Godzilla fighting creatures from Jupiter, or Venus or whatever. They become these kind of
it's
sci-fi
Planet
battles.
X. I just have to sorry.
I just love those. Which one is Nick Adams in? Is that's
it? That's the one. It's Monster Zero. Yeah,
I love that. It's see you when you get back from Jupiter, baby. It's just this weird West Side Story meets kaiju. I love that film. Anyway, so kaiju, so the space age and kaiju movies sort of merged together in the early 1960s. And around this time, the gentleman who is responsible for all of the special effects in those movies, Eiji Tsuburaya, decides, hey, it's cool to be making these kaiju movies for the silver screen and all, but I think the future's in television. I want to start making sci-fi stuff for TV. Right, and so Tsuburaya basically went out and he launched his own production company, Tsuburaya Productions, which we all know very well as the company that basically, using its own money, made Ultraman. First, it made a show called Ultra Q, to be exact, but made Ultra Q, and Ultra Q turned out to be a hit. And then they got the rights to make Ultraman. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here, because at this point in Japanese toy history and basically in global world history, it was understood that kids wanted to dress up and pretend to be the characters of the shows that they liked. So most toys back then were either kind of like props or, kind of disguised dress up sets, like dress up like a Lone Ranger or something like that. Yeah. Or like, a toy gun that a kid could carry around and pretend to be the hero. There weren't much in the way of what we think of as like figures today. Little avatars of the heroes that you see on screen that you can kind of, stage battles with. It was believed that you wanted to be the hero and you would be staging battles with your friends outside and things like that. And merchandised, licensed merchandise either took the form of that kind of stuff or, put the character on a lunchbox. Put the character on a picture on the side of a car or something like that. So you didn't really see now the actual merchandising of the characters themselves. It was the heroes who were used to sell products that were often designed for totally different purposes. And we've all seen this kind of stuff, right? It's like some like a telescope or something that has like Astro Boy's picture on the side. It's like, why do I want this? I want like Astro Boy. It was Saburo Ishizuki at Marusan, the same gentleman who I was talking about before and who's now running the Bullmark reissue company now. He is the guy who got the idea of, hey, maybe we should make figures of the kaiju. Maybe we should actually make the kaiju themselves. And at the time, this was seen as completely like not even outside the box thinking. Like people thought he was nuts. And in fact, he faced a lot of pressure inside the company. Even I believe the president of the company is like, no way, no kid wants just the kaiju. Like, and Ishizuki-san would say things like, well, we made this Godzilla plastic model kit and kids really liked it, and that's basically a figure, right? And the guy's like, no, kids buy that because they want to build it. They don't want the actual kaiju itself. Yeah. And it was just fundamentally different mindset. And Ishizuki-san had the foresight, the genius, to realize that no, kids actually wanted the finished Godzilla. That's why they built the kit. The play value wasn't in the building of the kit, although it was, of course, but it was in having this finished thing. And what if you could just get that? And so he finally got permission, and he drove out to Tsuburaya Pro, where he was met by Tsuburaya's son, Tsuburaya Eiji's son, Hajime, I believe his name was. And he's just like, I can't believe you're crazy enough to want to license this show about Ultra Q. And Ishizuki-san's like, hey, man, can I do it? And they're like, sure, whatever, do whatever you want. And Ishizuki secured the rights to make vinyl toys or toys of the monsters, not the heroes, not the humans. To Ultra Q starred humans. It starred 3 humans, but he didn't. He kind of leapfrogged that. He just wanted to make toys of the kaiju, and he, at the time, the best material for making toys of the kaiju was soft vinyl. It was cheap and easy to work with, and best of all, like he licensed Ultra Q when it was already on the air, like it had aired for quite some time, and he knew that if he didn't get the toys out by the time the show finished airing, he would miss his window,
right? Yeah, to
have the free merchandising and the free marketing, right?
Yeah.
So the only way to make toys quickly enough was using vinyl. I'll save you the whole story of why that is. I'm sure there's other people coming on who can tell you much more than I can about how vinyl toys are made. But he chose that specifically because he got a late start and could get the toys out while Ultra Q was still on. And even after he made them, and that's a whole story in and of itself, he found this guy who was a ceramics maker. He was making little ceramic figurines and had that gentleman. Yes, he made like little ceramic like deer and little ceramic bunny rabbits and things for export and for souvenirs and stuff.
Yeah.
And Ishizuki picked this gentleman because he was worried that making kaiju would be too, aggressive, too scary for kids.
Right.
So he deliberately had this guy who was a kind of expert at making kind of cute looking animals and stuff, sculpt the initial prototypes for the kaiju so that they would look a little bit more rounded, a little bit more approachable. Because, he knew that kids love them, but he also knew that kids were afraid of them. And actually, when I interviewed him about this, I distinctly remember him saying, yeah, when I'd watch kids watching Ultra Q, a lot of them, the little ones in particular, would be watching, like this. Like when the kaiju came on the screen, they'd be kind of hiding to see it. So like to us, we think of kaiju as this really cool thing. We want to line them up on our shelves and stuff. But to kids back in the day, they were kind of like shocking that these grotesque creatures were showing up in their living rooms, and that was part of the fun. It was this kind of X-Files kind of thing. It was this kind of creepy horror sort of thing. So Ishizuki was really smart in picking the kaiju as objects, to make products of, but he was also, I think, really smart in deliberately making them look a little bit softer than they appeared on screen, which is where that whole aesthetic that we now associate with Marasan and
absolutely
comes from, right?
Dude, that is amazing. I can totally see that, right? Like someone working in ceramics would have to be very careful about sharp edges too. It just and even making like a mold off of something that maybe had sharper edges would dull down. Oh man, that's fantastic, man. Thank you for that information.
Well, the great thing is he makes these things and he still can't really sell them. Like he goes around to the wholesalers and they're like, oh man, I don't know. It was so different from the types of toys that have been sold to that day that he really had a hard time convincing wholesalers to pre-order enough to make the first run. And finally, he did. He managed to convince enough of them to do it. But it wasn't clear at all whether this would be successful. And his reputation was really riding on it. The president of Marasan at the time, not Kaminaga-san, this is way before Kaminaga-san's era, we're talking the 1960s, was basically like, this is your responsibility. And Ishizuki-san told me that he had some kind of sleepless nights and some real, stressful days waiting to see what would happen. But all of a sudden the phone started ringing and it was these same wholesalers who had been really reluctant to pre-order and buy many of the toys. And they're like, hey, do you have any more? Do you have any more? Because we sold them out and the toy shops are desperate for more. They really want more. Fortunately, the great thing about soft vinyl is you can keep popping them out. And so Ishizuki-san went from this incredible stress at not knowing whether he was going, this idea of his was going to succeed and he was going to look like a fool, to all of a sudden, it was so successful, he literally couldn't sleep. They're so busy placing orders and filling orders. And back then, Marasan would actually literally be driving them around to wholesalers and things like that. They couldn't keep up with demand. Wow. And that sparked this entire revolution in toy making. I believe that Ishizuki-san is actually the innovator of the action figure. Long way before somebody like, George Lucas came up with the idea that all the money is in the figures and let's make a figure of every single character so kids want to collect them. Ishizuki-san came up with that idea. Let's make every kaiju that we can. Let's put them out. So it's really this sort of forgotten chapter in toy history. I don't think a lot of people in the West realize how pivotal and how profoundly transformative it was that Ishizuki-san and Marasan came up with this idea of making articulated vinyl dolls, action figures of these kaiju. And that's basically, in a nutshell, how they came to be created.
That's fantastic. I'm first of all, I was already fascinated by the process at which they were made. Now, knowing almost the fact that they almost didn't happen, the fact that somebody could have said no, and that could have been just it for that idea.
But it's like a lot of a lot of really truly transformative ideas. The line between genius and madness is very thin. Now we're just like, what? Of course you're gonna make toys of all the kaiju. Of course you are. But there was a before and an after, and Ishizuki-san is the one who pushed humanity from the before into the after, and that actually triggered this huge boom for kaiju in Japan. And by 1967. you had this, what I call the year of the kaiju. There's like 8 kaiju related shows on TV. There's multiple kaiju movies coming out. Kids are obsessed with them. It's a gotta get them all kind of thing. The emperor, the emperor's son is spotted buying kaiju toys in a toy store, which makes like kind of waves in a positive way. Like it's talked about on the talk shows, and adults are talking about kaiju. All of these kaiju related words start entering the Japanese lexicon. Like probably the one that's most famously known as mamagon, which is, they put the gon suffix onto mom, and that's for like a helicopter mom. Back in the late 60s, if there was you had like a really aggressive helicopter mom, she's a mamagon, just like Baragon or something like that. So, kaiju really became this like part of the fabric of Japanese society. And of course they were, these movies and stuff were exported abroad, but unfortunately the toys really weren't. Right. Unless you lived in Hawaii and got all of those awesome, like weird spray variants. But, I certainly, when I was a kid growing up, I hungered for more kaiju toys, but the only thing we really had were the big, the Shogun Warrior. There's like those Aurora kits. There was some kind of cheap bendy toys or something like that. But Americans didn't really, grown up Americans didn't really take Godzilla and kaiju movies seriously. So I don't think they made much of an effort to market them to us, which ironically is part of what stoked my interest in Japan. They had all the cooler stuff over there.
Right? Oh, right, yeah. You got it. Well, that burning desire to get that thing that you can't get just down the street, right?
Yes. Yeah. I mean,
absolutely.
I don't know about you, but I actually am like, I almost deliberately do not collect stuff that I had when I was a kid. Like I'm not interested in Star Wars toys because I think they're great. And they're really awesome. But like I had a ton of Star Wars toys as a kid. Yeah. And, I had most of the ones, not everything, of course, but I had most of the ones I wanted. So the drive to get those is not nearly as high. It's basically zero compared to stuff that like, I thought maybe existed far away on the other side of the ocean, but there was absolutely no way to get. Well, I'm going to get it now, kind of is my psychology. I know it's different for everybody, but I'm always attracted to that kind of stuff that I could never have had, even if I wanted it when I was a kid.
That's a very strong pull for even me. Like I went to LA a couple of years ago, and there was a store in Burbank that had a whole bunch of toys that came out in the mid 90s. And that when I was like super broke. I didn't have good money coming in. And so there were a ton of things that came out that I couldn't buy. And I was like, this is a dangerous store for me. I'm going to buy a bunch of stuff I don't need. And this collection used to be way more than just kaiju. And after a while, I just sort of like got rid of most of that stuff. And I just really honed it in.
I've been kind of reducing mine to kind of distilling it. I like to think of distilling it, not reducing it. But when I first moved to Japan in college in '93, that was the year. I'm not sure if it's the year, but it's pretty close to the year that Mandarake was founded. And at the time they were located in a different place. Their first shop was on Love Hotel Hill in Shibuya. And I stumbled across it, and why it was in Love Hotel Hill, we'll leave for a different discussion. But I remember being like, I was a college kid, right? And Tokyo was expensive at the time. Like the yen was like 80 yen to the dollar was horrific, and it was really tough, on everybody. My parents were, of course, sending me money and stuff, but we couldn't work. You weren't like allowed to have a side job or anything like that. And I was like, fuck, man. I walked into Mandarake, and like back then it was crazy. It was like the Creature Cantina in Star Wars. They had shit like actual like costumes, heads and things on the shelves. They had like the rarest things you've ever seen. You could literally walk in there and stumble across just props from shows that had been mixed in with the toys and things like that, because it wasn't as developed of a collector market back then. Right. And I was too broke to afford most of it. It was just, I was like, if I could, if only, if you had like your purchasing power of like a, a middle-aged person back then. I mean, this is a classic story, right?
Right. God. Absolutely.
I remember having to pass up, there was a head of one of the kaiju from Goggle 5, which is a kind of 80s tokusatsu series. The robot was really released as a Godaiken in America, but the show was never aired. And it was this like funky chicken head. It was like the head. It was the kaiju suit head. And I was like, wow, to actually own a piece of a kaiju. Like it felt like, you know, being like an archaeologist or something. But of course, I couldn't afford it. So somebody has it now. I don't know. If you have that funky chicken head, let me know. I'm interested. I remember it and I want it.
Nostalgia's going to catch up, and Matt's going to get chicken head.
Yeah.
Man, just a small taste. We're talking many, many years after what you're mentioning. Like in 2013, my wife and I were in Japan on our first trip together, and we walked into, I think, Jungle in Akihabara.
Yeah.
Just walking into that store, just expecting to see toys, they had a display of props and suit heads from Sakuya Yokaiden, which is literally one of my favorite tokusatsu movies of all time. I was like, how is this possible? And Japan has been just the magical place ever since.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's not a lot of call for making suits and props like there used to be. I mean, I know they're still made for the Power Rangers shows, but there aren't really many like full-on tokusatsu movies being made anymore, which is really kind of a shame. It's shifted to CG and stuff like that. Even Tsuburaya, I think, has shifted in a really big way to using CG in their latest productions. I mean, it's the way of the world. It's you know, you're appealing to kids. You're not appealing to like nostalgic middle-aged dudes. So
have you seen their new show, Ultraman Z?
I have not actually.
They did the past couple of series. Honestly, they have played heavily towards, I think, their older audience.
Sure,
a lot of old school characters coming back, like Gomez and Naranga. Like, it's good. Fun stuff, but I see what you mean for sure.
Well, I think now it's shifted. It's like adult parents watching it with their kids.
Yes,
nostalgic parents watching it with their kids, and that I think started. I actually really noticed that when I moved here around 2003, because a lot of the people who we met here were just starting to have, you know, of our age group. This is like 17 years ago. We're starting to have kids back then, and I know a lot of them, especially with the Kamen Rider series. There was a lot of like parent-son, parent-daughter, you know, watching of that going on. Yeah, certainly in my, you know, circle of friends. Maybe they're just like tokusatsu obsessed, which is entirely possible.
You mean that's not the entire country?
Exactly. Doesn't it? Well, you know, when I first moved here, I'm like, wait, there's not like anime on every 24/7, every TV. People aren't all collecting, you know, Japanese robots. So. Yeah, so just to bring this back to full circle, I got into vinyl pretty late in my collecting life. I think you were pretty much, that was your first focus from the beginning, right?
I mean, I basically, the very first collectible thing I ever bought was one of the big Bandai figures, you know, but it's true to what you were saying, like that was at the time what you would have to get if you wanted to get something that looked like it was on the movie screen, you know?
Yeah,
and I love those things. And it wasn't until I think, I'm going to guess it had to have been the Marmot Monster Heaven line that came out that started making me look at the soft vinyl look, you know, those softer edges that you were talking about, you know? Yes. But ever since then, I mean, I'm sort of split down the middle. I've got the realistic stuff over here, and I've got all the soft vinyl stuff over here.
And it's interesting to see they're both developing. There's all that like X Plus stuff that is like super realistic. It's like super prop level. Yeah. And then you have the people remaking the old Bullmark stuff that's like kind of chubby and soft. And I remember like having a real resistance to that chubby Bullmark aesthetic when I first saw it, because I didn't have any personal experience with it. You know,
no nostalgia.
To me, I wanted what I saw on the screen, but you know, I got it. You know, I understood where it was coming from, and you know, some of those things are real. I mean, works of art, especially like the giant-sized bull marks and things like that. The paint application on them is just nothing like anything in the realistic series. It's just really beautiful stuff, and I've kind of deliberately stayed away from it. Like, you don't want to start collecting Bullmark or Marathon now. God, the prices are just bizarrely, insanely high. So
it's a really weird market right now.
Although the plus is that you can get all sorts of reissues and things like that, ranging from exact reissues to, remember those like Bullmark, like the capsule Bullmark figures?
We've actually
really
got
well done.
later on in this later on in our day of programming, we'll have a vintage versus repro panel
wow.
with some of our some toy collectors from around the world.
Right.
Anyway, little plug for later.
Stay tuned.
I guess,
Stay
right?
tuned. Yes.
Anyway,
I guess if there's any, not that I'm not that I'm, looking to run away or anything here, but in closing, toys are really directly connected to history. Like, you can, it's great to collect the toys and it's fun to collect the toys, but it's also important to remember that they're kind of artifacts of a certain place and time in history. And there are reasons why they look the way they do and why they emerged when they did.
Right. Definitely.
And so it's really, to me, like, I love the toys, but it's also really fascinating to try to figure out what those socioeconomic, socio-political sort of backgrounds to them are. I mean, Japan was going through a huge baby boom in the mid 1960s because everybody had come back from World War II and 45, and in the years after they kind of started to recover, had a lot of kids. So there's a huge peak. There's so many kids that need to be entertained. There's so many kids that need to, that represent a market. That's why the Japanese toy industry really flourished in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And actually, Japan is facing a huge demographic crisis today because the birth rate's declining. And it really makes you wonder, how is this going to impact Japan's toy making industry? How are things going to change because of that? Because now, look, we're talking about reissues of kaiju being sold to 40 and 50-year-olds. Well, what are kids playing with? They're not really playing with physical toys anymore. They want data, is my understanding.
Oh, yeah. How do you datafy giant monsters for the kids today?
Cards, like they want cards, they want games, they want AR experiences. Like the generation of kids who grew up playing Pokemon and then watching Pokemon in the late 1990s is no less obsessed with monsters than we are. They're obsessed with little pocket-sized monsters, but they are equally obsessed. But the interesting thing is they're not really interested in physical representations because their interactions with the Pokemon were always through interactive mediums, like on the Game Boy,
Right.
or the cards, So they were always like, to them, the Pokemon were always training Pokemon or with them in that kind of format. So like, I think that's why you see Pokemon cards are worth a fortune. Versus some kind of you would think there would be 1 million Pokemon soft vinyls and that kids would be, the kids who are now 30 years old would be killing each other to buy them. But in my experience, that's not the case. Like, Pokemon are about the data of the Pokemon. They're about the existence of them much more than they are to, we're old analog people, right? Those are like the digital, that's like the digital age. So it's interesting to see other chicks.
Turning it into data, turning it into a different kind of asset for the kids, and especially thinking about, like you just said, people who were kids in the 90s, and now they are the ones that are having that boom of income and, are able to outbid their other cohorts, and raise those prices for anything from their nostalgia. Absolutely.
Exactly. Because, you and I'm assuming I would never imagine paying $1,000 for a Pokemon card, but
I wouldn't.
But there's people out there, who do that because they remember it. And actually, this is directly connected to the soft vinyls and stuff, because when Satoshi Tajiri, who is the guy who invented Pokemon, his initial proposal for Pocket Monsters was called Capsule Monster. They had to change it to Pocket Monster because of some copyright infringement thing that they did when they did a name search before the product came out. But and this is online, you can actually search for Capsule Monster proposal online and find it. His initial screens, like, he mocked them up. He drew this is what the game screen will look like. It featured Godzilla fighting King Kong. That was his, and he gave them like different names. It was like Godzilla Ante versus something Kong. But it's obvious that he was inspired by kaiju movies. Yeah. So, and I'm sure he played with kaiju toys growing up as a kid. And so without the kaiju, Japan, like, those helped pave the way for what's arguably Japan's biggest IP of all time, way bigger than, Godzilla or Hello Kitty or anything like that. I mean, Pokemon's kind of unbeatable. So it's an evolution of that concept. So if you hate on Pokemon, stop hating on them. They're kaiju. They're like a little kaiju.
Tiny
Stop
little
the hate.
kaiju.
Make
and they
toys,
have
not war.
that connection to Ultra 7, technically speaking. He had those capsule monsters he would throw.
Yes.
I mean, it's not a legit connection, but anyway.
Yes.
Actually, tell me a little bit about, because I'm assuming when the kaiju boom happened in 1967, and then the soft vinyl industry, or I won't say industry, but the soft vinyl toy explosion happened from there, because I've seen, as people I'm sure are going to see during this day, I've seen way more than just kaiju. I've seen a lot of heroes turned into soft vinyl toys and beyond. How did the soft vinyl portion of the industry sort of like shake up after the kaiju boom ended? Like, did the soft vinyl industry, the Sofubi style, like continue until the 90s when Bandai came in and did their new stuff?
The word boom implies the opposite, which is a bust. And that's exactly what happened. Like the year after, Tsuburaya made Captain Ultra, which flopped mightily. And basically, Marusan was stuck holding like warehouses full of product that it couldn't sell. And then Marusan ran into a series of other issues, which it's kind of in the weeds to get in there, but they went out of business. And when Bullmark came back, when Bullmark emerged out of kind of the wreckage of that, they did continue to make kaiju. As we know, there's plenty of Bullmark kaiju, but we're talking at that point, like Bullmark comes online like 68 or something like that, right? There's already, the fads are quickly changing. The kaiju boom was followed by a yokai boom, actually, for Mizuki Shigeru's Gegege no Kitaro and sports manga at the same time. Kyojin no Hoshi, which is a big baseball manga, Ashita no Joe, which is a big boxing manga. So kids kind of move from kaiju into this kind of yokai and sports kind of things. And by the early 70s, kaiju were pretty out. What they were being replaced by was tokusatsu shows like Kamen Rider,
right? Yes.
Kikaider, like these rider shows came in. And then, of course, my kind of seminal moment in 1972, you get Mazinger Z, which is the first kind of modern giant robot show, super robot show. And when Bandai started making Chogokin, die-cast toys of the hero,
right,
which in a very real way are the kind of descendants of Ishizuki's idea, hey, kaiju, let's make kaiju figures, let's make them out of the most kaiju-like material that we have, which is squishy, rubbery, soft vinyl. Bandai's like, hey, we have this robot, let's make a robot figure out of the most robotic material we have, which is this zinc alloy die-cast metal. And that kind of like the idea that you were able to hold a kaiju in your hand, because they felt kind of like more like living things than a plastic model kit, or like,
right,
something was made of wood or paper or something like that. That, I think, was the same reason that the robot toys that Bandai started making in the early 70s really took off, because it really felt like you were holding a fragment of something you saw on screen. And that started this whole arms race for robot toys. The Bullmark shifted into it. They started sponsoring robot shows, made all sorts of robot toys. Some really, if you only know Bullmark's kaiju, you're probably not as familiar with their robot toys. Some of them were absolutely stunning and beautiful in how intricate they were and how, beautifully engineered and imagined they were. And then the kind of streams crossed. After Bullmark went out of business, Ishizuki-san founded a company called ARC. And ARC made vinyls, but they're much better known in the collecting world for making these die-cast metal robot versions of Ultra Kaiju.
Okay.
And they're like Legos. You can actually take them apart and recombine them. And they're called Arklons. That was the brand name. Arklon, Arklon. And Arc was a company that Ishizuki-san ran. So this has this pedigree going all the way back to the original, days, the post-war days of making tin toys in the 60s and making vinyl. And then he kind of synthesized it all together. He had, he took the idea of kaiju and he took the idea of die-cast metal robots and you got your chocolate and my peanut butter and bam, You get these amazing toys. The streams are always kind of, weaving and fusing and going their own ways and coming back. So, toy history, like all history, is just it's not snapshots. It's a flow of constant change, and you can actually look at that change to see what's going on in Japanese society, not only pop culturally, but as a nation as a whole, and for all of us.
So what happened after the bust and soft vinyl in conjunction with Japanese society? Like, where does that take us to? How does that get us to today, I guess?
Well, I can tell you one of the big problems that happened in the 70s was a bunch of oil shocks, OPEC and all of that. And, soft vinyl is petroleum based, right? And so it became very expensive to make toys out of things like vinyl. It became expensive to make toys out of things like polyethylene. Popey was making a lot of these jumbo toys, which were sold in the States as the Shogun Warriors. They had to start innovating it and making new types of products. And by the time the 70s rolled around, it's kind of auspicious I use the word new type, because what had happened was a generation of kids who had been raised on anime and live action shows had grown into young adults who still wanted to consume anime and live action science fiction shows. And this is kind of the foundation of otaku culture. And that's where you start getting shows like Gundam, which is a cartoon. It was initially aimed at kids, but quickly became consumed by teens and young adults. And you get this huge shift in the industry where pop culture isn't being made for kids anymore. Japanese pop culture is being made for teenagers and young adults. That's where you get this whole super robot boom of the 80s, the real robot boom of the 80s, where they're not so much superheroes. They're kind of anti-heroes, or they're damaged heroes. A kind of echo of what was going on in American comics at the time, where, heroes like Batman weren't just these kind of shining symbols of justice. They had these kind of dark backgrounds and histories and things like that. So, the industry is constantly changing. Japan is becoming, by the 80s, this massive financial tiger. It was the world's second largest economy, and everybody thought Japan was going to take over the world. They thought, if you look at movies from that era, if you look at like Blade Runner, it's like Los Angeles, Tokyo. It's like these geisha on billboards. There you go. Geisha on billboards, Blade Runner is basically the future that we thought we would get. William Gibson was talking about that in his books. And you can see it even in comedies and stuff. Like Marty McFly as an adult gets fired by like a salaryman in Back to the Future 2. There's always like Gung Ho and like all sorts of these movies where Japanese are kind of moving in on the American marketplace. But the funny thing is, at that exact same time, the American politicians are erecting all of these barriers to Japanese trade and to try to kind of correct the trade imbalance. But what they forgot to do was do anything about kids entertainment. So like all of this made in Japan anime and cartoons and live action shows start flooding into the American marketplace around this time. The Nintendo comes into the marketplace around this time. And this is where our tastes, people like you and I were kind of ahead of the curve, I think. And like we would seek out kaiju vinyls or things like that at like Asian gift shops and stuff. But like starting in the 80s, all kids' tastes started to Japanize because everybody's playing the Nintendo. Everybody's watching Voltron. Everybody starts to watch the Power Rangers in 91. Like, that's the real kind of missing link between 60s kaiju stuff and modern day American Western love for the stuff. So, you can see there's all sorts of stuff, playing out here. The toys are just one fragment of this kind of human experience that's happening.
Wow, man, Matt, it has been really fascinating hearing you talk about this subject, man.
Well, you're one of the few people who is willing to listen to me talk about this. So to normally people, you talk to like normal people and they're just like, you start, oh yeah, kaiju, and I'm like, it is great to actually be able to talk to people, not just you, but everybody listening who appreciates this stuff. And I hope if you can pick up my book, Pure Invention, How Japan's Pop Culture Conquered the World. There's the cover behind me with the anime eyes. You can read more about this kind of stuff. It's not all about toys, but it's a lot about toys.
Fantastic. Tell me a little bit about what's going on with you right now. I know we talked before the recording. You've been on a PR streak since your book came out.
Yes, I've been doing nothing but promoting the book, going on all sorts of podcasts. If you search my name, you can find them, and writing articles about kind of Japanese pop cultural topics for magazines like The New Yorker and places like that. So look for me online. I'm out there. Find me.
You are definitely out there, man. Actually, major shout out to you and your wife for YOKAI panel.
Attack.
I think that you did YOKAI Attack panel that you guys did recently on. It was broadcast online, and it was great seeing you guys together and interacting and talking all about creepy Japanese yokai.
Well, we're hoping to do more of that, and I will let you know when we do. We should do a yokai talk. Unfortunately, there's not many yokai vinyls, are there? I'd love to do a yokai vinyl.
Too many, but yeah, you know what, dude? Just on another thing, we'll totally hook up and do more yokai stuff.
Absolutely, man.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, hey, thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Matt.